It's quite a privilege to be hosting Jules Feiffer here this evening. Mr. Feiffer, of course, has enjoyed a now legendary career, really several overlapping careers as a cartoonist, playwright, screenwriter, children's book author, and novelist. The cartoonist came first when, as a 16-year-old, he landed a job as an assistant to Will Eisner, creator of the Spirit series, and arguably the most original and inspirational comic talent of his time. About a decade later, Mr. Feiffer started writing and drawing for the Village Voice, and his cartoons there, known for their spare lines and witty, sardonic, often politically barbed dialogue, ran in the Village Voice for 42 years and were syndicated to a wide variety of papers. He also has the distinction of being the first op-ed page cartoonist employed by the New York Times, a post he held in the late 1990s. Over time, Mr. Feiffer branched into books, plays, and movies, and has more than 36 of these to his name. He's received a Pulitzer Prize, an Academy Award, a George Polk Award, Obie Awards, and the Lifetime Achievement Awards from both the National Cartoonist Society and the Writers Guild of America. He's also taught at several universities, most recently at Stony Brook Southampton College. But at 85, he's hardly slowing down. Just last month, he published another children's book, Rupert Can Dance, featuring a dancing cat. And this evening, he's here to talk about his very first noir graphic novel, Kill My Mother. With this book, Mr. Feiffer pays tribute to the sort of stuff he loved and read as a teenager when he immersed himself in crime fiction and newspaper adventure strips. The book is dedicated to, among others, Raymond Chandler, Dashiell Hammett, James M. Cain, and three directors most associated with screen adaptations of their work, John Huston, Howard Hawks, and Billy Wilder. The book's setting in the Depression era and such locales as Bay City and Hollywood are classic, as are many of the characters and plot twists. But Mr. Feiffer has his own fun with the traditional genre by, for instance, giving women the leads and putting men in supporting roles, and rendering the main private eye almost always drunk. In this and other ways, Kill My Mother is, in the words of NPR, quote, a much livelier experience than even the wildest noir. The New York Times declared the book simply terrific, and a review in the Chicago Tribune really got into the mood of the book, saying this, quote, from the opening shot of a cathedral radio to the closing wail of a torch singer, you'll want to whistle in appreciation. You know how to whistle, don't you? Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Jules Feiffer.
Thank you. It's wonderful being here. It's always wonderful being at the store. And if I had a voice, it would even be more wonderful. It'll clear up. Excuse me. Talk amongst yourselves. What I love about the reviews, I love the reviews because I've been writing plays that are wonderful plays and movies that are wonderful movies. Never do they get this kind of review. I had to go back to comic books to get the kind of review I deserved all along. And one of my favorites was, I think it was Booklist, that said at the end, it makes the big sleep seem like 40 winks. Now, that makes me very, very happy. It's because all the way through Kill My Mother, which was a book I didn't know how to write and wasn't going to write, and kind of wrote itself piece by piece, day by day, and until it came time to draw it. And I knew I couldn't draw it because I didn't know how to draw in that style. So I tried to get half a dozen people I knew who can draw in that style to do it for me, and they all said, no, the sons of bitches. And finally, the publisher wanted me to try it myself, and they loved what I did. And I knew it was going to be, at the age of 83, at least 2 years out of my life, maybe more. So I appreciated none of this until I realized that that I was doing something that, until the age of 80 or a little older, I didn't know how to do, and I had learned how to do it just as in the 60s, when I went up to Yaddo to write a novel called Little Murders, and found I couldn't know how to write it, and did it as a play, and then I discovered I was a playwright. I mean, it's wonderful, these accidents that define a career, and my career has been nothing but accident, and basically I just Roger Rosenblatt, my friend, has a book called Boy Detective, in which he compares himself to a private eye on the as a writer, as a private eye who just follows one trail and one lead. And Roger and I have talked about this, that we both see ourselves as, out of the Bogey, Chandler, Hammett genre, because we both grew up with this stuff guiding our lives, both the writing and the pulps, and in particular the movies. And you, as a writer, you find you go down one street and it's not the right street, and you go back and there are red herrings and there are false clues, and the criminals who are your characters fool you when they go in a direction they weren't supposed to, and you have to clear up the mess. And you go through this over and over and over again, and that's what a career in writing is, and that's probably what most careers are. It befuddles me when parents at a very early age decides what their little children are going to be by enrolling them in the right school, the right kindergarten, the right preschool, in the hope that their career will be planned by the age of 3.5 or 4. And what do you know? The kids don't go along. Because they don't know what they want to do. Nobody knows what they want to do, except for me. I knew exactly what I wanted to do probably the first time I saw a Sunday supplement of a newspaper. A few of you are near my age. Nobody's quite as old. But when I was a kid, there were these giant Sunday supplements in full color. And by full color, I don't mean the crappy color you find in the papers today. They were gorgeously printed, and the artists who worked in these strips, Frank King, who did Gasoline Alley, and Cliff Sterrett, who did Polly and Her Pals, and E.C. Segar, who did Popeye, and the adventure strips, Alex Raymond, who did Flash Gordon. And my particular hero was a man named Milton Caniff, who did Terry and the Pirates, who taught me really how to look at adventure strips, who taught me how to think in terms of adventure strips, how to think in terms of a story. Caniff, along with Eisner, was the most innovative of talents in the adventure strip field. He followed in the wake of another great cartoonist named Roy Crane, who did a strip called Wash Tubs in Captain Easy. And Wash Tubs, these were the pre-World War II days and Depression years. And the home front was in such bad trouble. We were so demoralized that both in movies and in comic strips, adventure strips were soldiers of fortune going out to mythical kingdoms in the Far East. And we're strange-looking people who were called Chinese but weren't. But they had slanted eyes and they spoke funny language, and you couldn't trust any of them. But what Crane brought to this was a style of movement, which was just a joy to behold. You opened a wash tubs panel, a strip, 4 panels across on a daily, and the characters were leaping and cavorting and jumping. It was kind of a stair dance in 4 to 6 panels, and nobody ever stood still. And the fights all looked like the fights in when John Wayne and Lee Marvin are or Wad Bond are beating the crap out of each other, and everybody's having a wonderful time. And as in Popeye, when Popeye beat up somebody, the victim always enjoyed it. I mean, it was always there was a great gusto and joy to these early comic strips that stopped existing somewhere, in the mid 40s or 50 or early 50s, certainly during the war or after. But the days of the Depression, where I was a Jewish kid from the Bronx, and my father couldn't find work, as lots of fathers couldn't, and my mother made a living as a fashion designer, which meant she went to the rag trade, the garment district on 7th Avenue in the 30s, and sold sketches door to door. It got $3 a sketch for when she sold one. Those sketches were designed, tailored clothing, which then they would manufacture and sell for a lot of money, but she got $3 for it. And that's how we got through the early years of the Depression until we entered the war years. And so escape was about all you could do if you were not an athletic kid. The athletic kids, the normal kids, would go out in the street and they'd play ball and they'd run around and they'd get into fights and all of these things I was unequipped to do because I was undersized and undercouraged. I had no ability to be a Jewish boy in the Bronx, because the secret I've kept to myself until this moment, I really wasn't the son of Rhoda and Davis Feiffer, these two strange Polish Jews who I didn't belong to, because I was the son of an English lord. I belonged over in Surrey or Sussex with my grandfather, C. Aubrey Smith, and being raised like Freddie Bartholomew, who was my twin brother, in my family estate. And what I was doing with these total strangers, I don't know. But this was something I intended to find. I was going to get to the bottom of this, which perhaps was the beginning of my private eye career, and figure out how this mistake was made. And all I could think of in my childhood in the Bronx is, how the hell do I get out of here? How do I escape? There was a New York Central train track near the Bronx River, about half mile from my house. And when I was a young teenager, I would walk over there and I'd just stare at the tracks and stare at trains going by and think of jumping on a train and riding the rails, except I had never been anywhere and didn't have the courage to go anywhere. So I imagined myself going all of these places. So that's what comics became, the better of my imagination. Comics were the thing that gave reality to these wild fantasies I had, and I didn't think of them as escape. I thought of them as a documentary about my future, and that this was what was going to be my life. I was going to be a cartoonist, like one of the big boys, like Alex Raymond, who did Flash Gordon, like Roy Crane, like particularly Kniff. I wanted to do adventure. I wasn't thinking of doing funny stuff. I liked the funny stuff, but I saw myself as one of the storytellers. What I loved about adventure strips is they told us what they called a continuity, and it ran six daily pages and 4 panels or so, and then a Sunday page where they continued the story. And the stories they were supposed to last about 2 months. That was the rule, 2 to 2.5 months. And I studied this stuff. I mean, I educated myself, not just in not having fun just reading it, but trying to figure out how they broke the panels down, how they combined words and pictures, how they told the story. So basically, I was matriculating through a school of comics that was self-invented, trying to find out what the rules were. And I did the same thing when I went to the movies and saw the adventure movies and movie serials. Those movie serials weren't nearly on the level of the comics, because they really were crap. But and they were crap I enjoyed, but there was nothing to learn from them. And I liked the good stuff. But when I'd see the Thin Man, which I've now seen, I don't know, 40 or 50 times, and it's still as entertaining and wonderful as ever. And try to figure out how the combination between comedy and storytelling and suspense and telling a detective story and getting everybody all together in one room at the end to find out who the murderer is. I love that convention. When I wrote the original draft of Little Murders, that was the way the play ended, except it didn't, because it went on forever, that explanation. And when I showed it to the director, he got glassy-eyed. But I love these forms, and it was in me, for whatever reason, because I couldn't play ball, because I had no skills at being a boy, from the Bronx, because I was a displaced English lord. I mean, there are reasons for these things, folks. It's so being kidnapped worked out in my favor in the long run. And so I studied this stuff and wanted nothing more than to be part of that world. It was glamorous back in the 30s and 40s to be a cartoonist. Newspaper strips were a big deal. First of all, movies were mostly in black and white. They weren't much in color. That didn't happen until the 50s or so. And some of the great films were in black and white, but if you wanted to see color, the best color was in the Sunday supplements, and it could be extraordinary. And also the daily strips were these large size, so that the newspaper comic strip represented, in terms of how we, kids and grown-ups, approached it as a form of entertainment, the equivalent of, say, early television or even some cable TV today. People got involved with the characters. They talked about the characters. Radio comedy shows talked about endlessly about Dick Tracy and Lil Abner and it was all part of our culture, and that was a culture that I wanted to join, wanted to be a part of. I wanted to do that. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I certainly had no serious intent. I just wanted to be a funny guy or an adventure guy or one of those guys. And because of the twists and turns that life plays with you, and my life was an endless series of, the extension of that Jewish joke, you plan, God laughs. And that whatever I planned didn't work. I wanted to be an adventure strip cartoonist. I practiced. I didn't get to Carnegie Hall, and I didn't get to do the adventure strip because I was lousy at it. I could not draw in the style I wanted most to be able to draw in. I could pencil it okay, but when I tried to ink these things the way the big boys inked them, in heavy and light brush strokes, thick and thin brush strokes, uses of blacks, lots of backgrounds. I couldn't draw backgrounds. I didn't know what anything considered a background looked like. I couldn't draw a car. I couldn't draw a gun. My guns looked like they were made of butter. It didn't help that I didn't believe in research. Research I thought of as homework. Homework was not for Freddie Bartholomew. I was not going to sell myself out by doing homework. I was going to stand on my own 2 feet and do nothing about learning the craft that I had willed myself into being without learning anything by effort. I thought effort was a cheat. I thought these things. I thought I had the right, because of the power of my will, which was enormous. I mean, I knew that if I wanted to crush things with my puny little hand, I could do it if I just willed it. I belong to the Shazam generation. All you had to do is say the right magic word, and it would all fall into place. And I practiced many words, and they got dirtier and dirtier as I got older. And they didn't much help. So I was floundering around like crazy, but I wanted to do comics very, very badly. At the same time, I read children's books, There were a lot of. I was a devotee of Booth Tarkington and the Penrod stories and John R. Tunis, and his dog stories and other animal stories. And there was a writer, some of you remember, Will James, who wrote stories about Smokey the horse, which was made into movies with I forget who. Anyhow, they weren't very good, but Will James was a wonderful illustrator of his own books. And I love those stories. And so I love the combination of these things. I love the magic of words and pictures in particular, combining, finding a way of saying something and combining it with words that would tell the story. And that was all I dreamed of doing and wanted to do. It's when people think that I've made a sharp turn from the comic strip to kids' books and then to graphic novels, it all seems not like a sharp turn, but just another reshaping of the same direction I've been in all my life. These are forms. All the forms that I loved about till the age of 12, 13, 14. Comic strips, children's books, movies, theater, because there was a little theater in the west part of the Bronx that I used to go to, and that's when I first saw Streetcar and Death of a Salesman on not Broadway, but on the summer circuit. And all these things that I loved by the time I was a teenager, movies, and of course the early noir films. All these things became what I ended up working in and wanting to do. And somehow or other, through some very lucky magic, it turned out that if I fell in love with it by the age of 12 or 13, I found a way of doing it later on in one way or another. I mean, I invent myself, struggle myself, cheat myself into being able to work in that form. And so I never found, as people seem to, a gap between, say, my current book, Rupert Can Dance, about a dancing cat, and Kill My Mother. I was looking at a book I did with my daughter Kate just before I left a couple of days ago before I left to come to Washington. It was the first book I did with her. It was called Henry the Dog with No Tail, about her dog up on Martha's Vineyard, who's an Australian shepherd. They don't have any tails, and Henry fantasized having a tail. And I hadn't looked at that book in years. It came out about 10, 12 years ago. And it's drawn in pencil. It's a realistically drawn book, which was the first realistic book I did, because I had to draw Henry as he really was, and not a dog out of Bark George, but not a cartoon dog or pop dog, but a real dog. And so I had to get photographs of Henry and draw Henry from life. And then I had to get other dogs that Henry played with and went to the local library and got pictures of dogs. And then I got Henry to pose for me, which he was not very cooperative about. So Kate, my daughter, took photos of him and videos of him, and I looked at them and studied and copied that, pushed the pause button and copied them. And I made as realistic a book of children's art as I ever had before. And when I looked at that, I saw this is the early beginnings of the style that evolved into the Kill My Mother style. I mean, that I didn't know it and didn't intend it, but the very important transition into the sort of work I'm doing, which is much more realistic in Kill My Mother and in the trilogy that Kill My Mother will lead to, is the stumbling onto kids' books. And because each kid's book, from The Man in the Ceiling, my first, through them all, demanded a somewhat altered drawing style, certainly altered from the Feiffer strip, which was minimalist. It had to be, because in 6 or 8 panels I was talking a lot. I was never shutting up, and I was also had a job of explaining why relationships didn't work. I was trying to overthrow the government. Which I succeeded in doing finally, with mixed results. But that style, the style of the Feiffer strip, barely outlines, because the drawings were there just to cover the text, which was the real story. And if I played with angles and different sight lines and more complicated art, it would take away from the reader understanding what I'm saying when I was trying to get across something sometimes very in simple language but complex ideas. So the Feiffer strip, had I continued in that drawing style, never could have evolved into what Kill My Mother became, or the talent I developed in order to be able to do Kill My Mother. The kids' books, beginning unknowingly with the Phantom Tollbooth, which I did years early in the 60s, the kids' books were the transition. It gave me the reason to learn how to draw in a different way. And it provided the impetus to look at the works that would inspire me. I had, when I was living in New York, a huge cartoon library and comics library of stuff going back to the 1890s, but particularly in the 1930s and 40s, the cartoonists I loved. And each time I had to illustrate a new children's book, I'd go to one of my masters, trying to figure out whom I'm going to steal from in this book. And I studied these, just went through until the light bulb went off on my head, which cartoonists always have happened to them. And that's how I would pick out a style for, because each story was, as far as I was concerned, was governed by the text. And the text demanded a certain kind of art. And all of it had to do with storytelling. One art form didn't necessarily fit a story. If I tried to draw the man in the ceiling the way I drew Bach George, it wouldn't have made any sense at all. If I did my book, A Room with the Zoo, the novel I did about my daughter Julie, to look like the Daddy Mountain, one of my picture books, again, it wouldn't have worked. Each of these books had to be governed by the text. As far as I was concerned, everything I did, every thought I had in relation to my work was governed by the story I was telling and the text and what drawing style would work. It's a little like working in theater. Now when I'm doing this graphic novel and I have to design a character, I don't know what that character is going to look like. I've written the script, the way you write a play script. And then I have a character come on stage, which is paper. And the character draws itself with my hand. And the character looks at me, I look at the character, and I say, "You're very good, thank you, next." And it's like an actor auditioning. It's very much like my experience in plays. And I have these characters. So with Rupert Can Dance, I had endless cats of different varieties, sizes, shapes. And with the little girl, the same thing. I had her dark-haired, light-haired, different kind of ponytails, different colors, and it went on and on. And each one of them, I'd say, "Thank you, you're very, very good," and and then I'd fire them and bring in the next one. And so there was this, and the connection between my experience for years in the theater and in film, helping with the casting, is exactly the same process as I now find doing these graphic novels. And this graphic novel came about, again, out of just a logical changes in my life that forced me into this situation, which 20, 30 years ago would not have been necessary or possible. It's called age, folks. And I aged brilliantly into deafness, and I aged even more brilliantly into not being able to walk very far, so that walking a city block, which I used to do in seconds, would now take me 10 minutes. And so all of the things, I loved living in New York all these years. Loved it, because the city was a challenge, and I was beating down that challenge. I was coping with that city, super coping with that city. There was nothing I couldn't do in that city. And I would walk for miles every day, and I would have a little notebook, and I'd sit down and I'd write notes, and I would write scenes from plays or cartoons or one thing and another. I was using that city as it was never used before, until one day I got, something happened. I don't know what happened. And it's a little like Rip Van Winkle. Suddenly the city was beating the hell out of me. Suddenly every challenge that the city offered, I was defeated. And so each day I woke up, and instead of coping, I felt humiliation. I felt old. And I didn't want to work. I didn't want to go outside. I didn't want to walk the dog. I didn't want to do those things because I'd be walking very fast, and some 75-year-old lady would zip past me as if I was standing still. And it was ghastly. Now I have to interrupt my own story to tell you. I lived next door. I was living on West End Avenue and 75th Street. Next door was a residence for seniors called the Esplanade. And people in their 70s and 80s who lived there for years would sit outside on the bench, and they were retired from life, and so they looked older than people who were still functioning, and they're just sitting there looking very old. And when I was still living in the city, I got out of the subway at 72nd Street and started walking, and realized that I have a half a block away from me, walking rather slowly, so that I was about to catch up to him, was Eli Wallach, who I'd known for years. And Eli was in his upper 80s by that time, and he was walking with a cane and not very fast. And then we got within half a block of the Esplanade, where all these people are sitting on benches, and Eli lifts his cane up to his shoulder. He straightens out. He zips past. Everybody recognizes him. They look, they gawk, and they can't believe it's Eli Wallach practically dancing past them, tap dancing. And then he gets a block away and he goes slumps again. And that's the game. That's you make that impression. You get but I was through being able to make that impression or make any headway with the city. I had started teaching out at Stony Brook Southampton College because of an invitation from Roger Rosenblatt, who invited me to teach a class. I'd just been fired by the Village Voice, who decided they were paying me too much money. And as the editor said, who sadly just died a few weeks ago, as the editor who fired me said, we could pay 3 reporters for what we pay you. But we'd love to have you in the paper, continue the strip, which we love, but we'll buy it out of syndication, which means that we'll pay you 80% less than what you're getting. So I thought he was making an offer I was designed to refuse, and I refused it. And suddenly I was out of the paper, and then it became a story the next day in the New York Times, and I got a call from Roger, among other people. And he said, I'm not interested in your self-pity and whining. I just want to know what's your insurance situation. And I said, it's over by the end of the year. And this is in May. And he said, well, I'm starting this writing program, and you're going to come out here and teach. And we offer you zilch, but you'll be fully covered, and your family will be fully covered. And I said, what do I teach? And he said, anything you want. I said, how often do I come? He said, as often as you want. I said, what days? When do I start? He said, stop bothering me. So I started going out to Southampton once a week on the bus called the Jitney, and I would teach a 3-hour class, and then there was about an hour wait for a bus, so that would take place at a bar called the Tidewater. And then I go home, and I had I'd never been teaching before, and I loved it. I had a great time. It was called Humor and Truth, and I began the class by saying, in this class, it was an MFA class, and I said, in this class, you have a license to fail, and if you don't fail, I'll fail you. I wanted them to take chances. I wanted them to take risks, and I found that if I made fun of them gently, and they knew I was supportive, they would do anything. And I got them to do things they didn't know they could do, and I felt as if I belonged there, and this was something I knew how to do. And then when it came time to work on the book of a musical of The Man in the Ceiling for Broadway, something that looked like was going to happen and then became aborted, and now it's on again. Um, I borrowed the house of a friend who was one of my students out there just to go and write, and discovered I loved it out there, and that I worked better out there, and I was lucky enough to have my marriage collapsing at the same time, so that I could go out there and live with my dog and cat, and got several places to. But I was more productive out there, and discovered that the age thing didn't seem to matter. That if I couldn't breathe and couldn't walk, I could get in a car. That all the things that were frustrating and defeating, I could pretend it weren't there because I could sit, I could work, I could have a glass of wine or two, I could eat whatever I wanted. I could live this kind of play life where I had no responsibility except the deadline that was self-imposed, and to figure out how to make a living out of all of this. As time went on, as I got my, because I was always, whatever success I had, was always one step ahead of the sheriff. And it's been terrific, because out of my living out there, I had the freedom to work in these forms, which I wouldn't have done, and the freedom to play. That's all I'm doing is playing. That writing this comic book, which is called a graphic novel, it's a comic book. And but it's a comic book unlike other comic book because it's also a play and a screenplay, because that's how I write dialogue. So what I've learned about writing dialogue in plays and screenplays is in there. And it's also because I love dance. I was bitten by Fred Astaire at a very early age. That it's full of dancing and dancers, just as Rupert can dance is full of dance. That this is in everything I do. So basically, while this has nothing to do with autobiographical content, and nothing in the story vaguely connects to anything in my own life, all of it is a kind of autobiographical sketch of my life as an artist and how it evolved, and using the different forms as an artist to turn into one thing that allows me to be the writer, the director, the photographer, and the editor saying, "That's crap, cut that," and do it over and over and over again. Now I'm 7 pages into the second volume, which is called Cousin Joseph. And then I have plans for a third book, which is called Archie Goldman and the Decline of the West, which will be about the blacklist years in Hollywood. And it's all fun. It's serious fun, but it's fun. And I thank you for coming and listening to all of this. Now, if there are any questions that you have for a deaf man, please take a shot and ask them. Yes. Can you come up front? Can you sit in my lap and tell me what the question is?
I've admired your work for quite some time. I grew up in North Jersey. I also loved the 60s in New York with the Pushpin group and all that happened there. And I'm a graphic designer that finds himself doing more and more illustration, and I've started a workshop with our street paper here called Street Sense, teaching the vendors illustration. And I'm wondering any advice you can give me to teach them how to be better illustrators, and then the real hard part is breaking into the business.
Look, the real hard part for me was breaking into the business, and if the Village Voice hadn't existed, I don't think I still would have broken into the business. I mean, I think it's so much as luck, and also some of it, and the rest of it. Let me get up here and sit down for this.
Okay.
Let's see. How do you do this? Is there an elevator? There were two things. First of all, don't listen to the experts. Don't listen to anybody who really knows you have to tell you how to do it, including me. Two, no matter how many bad things you hear about what you're failing to do, assume that what everybody tells you is only half true and go on. And anybody we all get pissed on. We all get discouraged. And the only ones who have a chance of making it and do make it are the ones who ignore that. I mean, they ignore it with effort. They ignore it with pain. They ignore it with rage. But they keep going on.
Matisse said creativity takes courage, and obviously you have that. And the people I teach have this amazing amount of courage. And so that's almost the easy part for me as a teacher. And it's just, I just want to
They just
get
have
them
to
started.
keep, and the only way to learn how to do this is to keep drawing. Draw all the time.
I agree.
And draw everything.
Yeah.
But draw and don't look over your shoulder at what everybody else is drawing.
Right. Find your own
Don't
style.
be influenced by, I mean, what has killed, you see this in school. The death of art is education, as we all know. That when you go to your kid's school and preschool, and you see the art on the wall, it's gorgeous, and it's inventive, and it's innovative, and it's exciting. And first grade, just incredible. Kindergarten, incredible. First grade, second grade. By third grade, it's not so incredible anymore. It's not all that interesting. By fourth grade, it's really not interesting at all, because the kids have learned to look at what everybody else is doing, begin to doubt themselves, and then they get advice from the grown-ups, the teachers, who tell them the right way the hand looks, or the right way this looks, or the right way. The people who are there to help you can kill you. And that's what art appreciation has done, so much writing class has done. The people who are supposed to be there to elevate you are too often there as giving you guidelines that you're going to fail at meeting, and fill your head with what you can't do, the restrictions you can't do, and instead of finding your own way around this and out of this, you can be so your spirits can be so dampened by the defeat of rejection, and humiliation, and that you just stop. I mean, how many would-be artists with real talent just quit entirely at a certain point because it doesn't look right, and they know it doesn't look right because that's what they're being told. It may have looked right to them when they did it. So you have to learn, and it's difficult, to not listen to the judges, not listen to the judgment out there. And also at the same time, if there's anything in that judgment that strikes you as a germ of truth, not a germ of deceit, of defeat, you have to take that and run with it. Because people can say things that are of great value, and you have to learn how to separate one from the other. It's very, very difficult. All I do as a teacher is try to teach my kids not to write but to think, how to think for themselves, how to edit themselves so they don't need somebody else to edit, how to ask questions that they depend on other people to do, how to be tough on themselves because they are likely to be a friendlier critic than the people around them. And once they learn that, they can write. So that's a long answer to a very short question,
Thank you
and I
very
bet you're
much.
sorry you asked. Yeah.
Got one over here for you. Got
Well, on the other hand,
double-barreled
Jules,
microphones. So.
on the other hand, some people start drawing and making art halfway through their life. But my question is, since you're talking about cartoons in the newspapers in the 30s and 40s, can you say what percentage of those newspaper cartoonists were from the New York area? New York City, I mean.
Very few, actually. The comic book artists, the guys who are doing action comics and adventure comics and DC comics and Marvel comics, were almost all from New York or New Jersey, and a heavy preponderance of them Jews. The comic strip guys who did the newspaper strips before them, from the 1900s into the 50s, were from all over the country, and a very small percentage of them were Jews. They were a lot of Irish, and they were from all over. Roy Crane was from the Midwest. Kniff was from Ohio. Al Capp, who did La Lambda, was from Cambridge, Mass. Um, Among the great ones, it's hard to think. Harriman, who did Crazy Cat, started out in New Orleans and ended up in New Mexico, I think it was. Walt Kelly, who did Pogo, one of the great strips of all time, lived in Connecticut. I think if he lived in New York at all, it was not for long. So, the comic book guys came from New York, or a lot of them did, but not the newspaper guys. Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Okay, yeah, I really enjoyed your early stories, your stories of your early childhood drawing. And I was also struck by your mentioning your mother and her supporting the family by, through fashion design, which I assume involved drawing. I'm wondering the connection between the two. Do you see a clear relationship? Did she actively encourage your drawing, or to do any?
She actively encouraged my drawing, and at the same time, the way parents do, gave you mixed messages about it. So she, my mother could have stopped. She was a very tough, strong woman, and she ran the show. I used to call my father a tenant in the house. I knew he belonged there, but I thought he rented a room, And when you ever asked him a question which required a decision, the answer would always be ask your mother, because he was terrified of getting his head cut off, which he did with every set. But my mother was very supportive of me being a cartoonist, and recoiled in horror at the kind of cartoonist I became because I made trouble. And my mother was a Polish Jew who fled with her family at the end of the 19th century, not from a direct pogrom, but an incipient pogrom. There was always an incipient pogrom going on in those years. And although she became a citizen, she never got over the thought that this could change in a second, that Jews could be attacked again in the United States. As a matter of fact, the only thing that slowed down anti-Semitism that she lived through and we all lived through in the pre-World War II years was World War II. And with Hitler killing all the Jews, the kind of much more genteel anti-Semitism that was part of the fabric of white America, and particularly white establishment America, took a back seat because it was a no-no during the war and after. But she never learned that they couldn't take her and put her away and put her on the boat again. So anytime one of her children, two of whom were loudmouths, one of whom was a member of the Communist Party, my older sister, I wrote a play about her, she was horrified, not because of what trouble we might get into, but what trouble we might bring down upon her. So my mother, while she supported us or supported me in my ambitions, I was the Jewish prince. I was the one male in the family. When I started to make trouble, she was ready to abandon me to an abandoned ship. That was what her stance always. When one of us got into trouble, there was never a teacher who complained about us who she didn't agree with, or because the teacher could hurt her reputation and we couldn't. So she was running scared all the time. And since I had decided after I got out of the Army in '53 that I was going to create pillage, and we're into the Cold War, which and McCarthyism, and I was going to try to do what I could to comment on this and help people move in a direction. I mean, those of you of a certain age all know that if you grew up, if you were college educated in the late 40s or early 50s, you came into the Cold War years somehow understanding you had no First Amendment rights if you were a liberal. And I mean, that was why the early voice strips created such a stir because I was saying things they talked about, that they thought about. They didn't know you would, they thought you'd get killed if you talked this way, even to each other, and I was doing it in public. They didn't realize that I couldn't endanger my career or my future because I didn't have one. That nobody could hurt me because I had been rejected by everybody. I'd been fired by everybody. I had nothing to risk, so I risked it and had a ball. But I also was saying things that had to be said, and people listened and paid attention. I mean, at that time, the only other one doing this was Mort Saul out at the Hungry Eye in San Francisco, which started 9 months before me. And then there was a Second City and Mike Nicholson and Elaine May. Suddenly there was a whole thing, and finally, most brilliantly, Lenny Bruce. But while the New Yorker was not allowing its cartoonists to have a point of view or any judgment, some brilliant people, and was very cautious about what it would let into print of an editorial nature, there were these bomb throwers in cabarets and me in my comic strip. And it was great fun being a bomb thrower at that time. And at the same time, the times felt terrible, and they were terrible.
Thank you. Okay, this one is your fault. Because you said you hated doing research, and yet I opened the first page of the book, and I'm looking at the back of the radio.
Yes.
And the detail is so amazing, and throughout the book, even though
Why don't you read the acknowledgments, fella? Huh?
I was only halfway through. You were talking.
No, the thing is I don't know how to, I don't see backgrounds. I know there's a bookstore here. But if I leave here and try to draw any detail of this bookstore, I won't know how to do it, and nothing will stay in my mind. On the other hand, how this lady, this beautiful woman over here is sitting with her arms folded, I can draw that in a second. I can draw you in a second. I may not be able to draw the clothes because I don't notice clothes either. So all of you might be naked. But I can draw and the human body in any position, and I notice that. I mean, gestures are such an important part of how I work. But I don't see things. I literally do not see inanimate objects. Until this book, I never drew an airplane. I never knew how to draw a car. What I did, I hired people to Google stuff for me, and then I was blessed with a 63-inch TV screen I went out and bought, and recorded all the Turner Classic movies I could find of the 30s and 40s, because the book starts in 33 and ends in 43, and war scenes too, but also the Hollywood Canteen, all these things, and they were up there, and I pushed the pause button, and Bogey would pose for me, and and Jimmy Cagney would pose for me. They were very, very helpful. And I would work, in the little room I had with the huge TV which dominated it, and I'd sit there drawing off the screen, and that's how I learned how to do this stuff. But I'd never done it before. But the thing, if you're going to do a noir book, it's atmosphere, and if you can't do cars on rainy streets and rainy slick streets, if you can't do crowded bars and a fight in the bar, if you can't do guns, I never knew how to draw a gun. Now I draw 45s and 38s, and I almost can draw them without a gun in front of me now. And maybe a year or two I will be able to. But I had to learn to do this rudimentary stuff because that's, as I said, everything is storytelling. And in the past, I didn't have to learn this because it wasn't important to the story. This story could only be told by an artist who knew how to draw this stuff. So I had to pretend so that I could get away with the reader that I actually knew how to draw this stuff, which I still don't know how to draw. But I'm a good faker.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So we have time for one more question here.
Yeah, you wrote a book about 50 years ago about the great American comic book heroes of your youth, and
Yes.
it included some of your art of the kind of comic book heroes. I just wondered what you thought of this efflorescence of Hollywood cinema, of the comic book, the disrespectable comic books of your youth, and what you think about what Hollywood has done to them.
What do I think about? What can you talk
What
about?
Hollywood, the
loudly?
Hollywood movies that are now making billions of dollars, the Spider-Mans and Batmans.
I love Spider-Man 2. which Michael Chabon, who wrote the great book, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, which affected me strongly. And which, by the way, he used the great comic book heroes as research material. And I only figured that out. He was so clever in planting this stuff that only halfway, I read 300 pages and was amazed at how much he knew. And then I realized I was the source. The son of a bitch. And then, in tribute to me, late in the book, he said, as Jules Feiffer said, and he gives a quote that I never said. But I think that book's a masterpiece. And I forget the question. Thank you very much.